All right. So, consensus, as I mentioned before, is the dominant ideal in this era where criticism of social or economic order is akin to disloyalty, and most Americans enjoy their freedom in private pleasures rather than in the public sphere. But this mass society will still have its critics, its voices of dissent. And those are who we're going to look at first in this idea. So, some of those leading critics come from scholars, people like Hans J. Morgenthau, who argued about new accumulations of corporate powers, C. Wright Mills and his power elite, which challenged the self-satisfied vision of democratic pluralism that dominates the mainstream, and wrote of instead a power elite, that is, interlocking directorate of corporate leaders, politicians, and military who dominated the government and society, making democracy obsolete. Freedom, he argued, rests on the ability to formulate available choices, something most Americans were denied. You also have David Reisman with his publication, The Lonely Crowd, making the argument that modern mass society will inevitably produce loneliness and anxiety, causing mankind to yearn for stability and authority, not freedom. Described Americans as other-directed conformists who lacked the inner resources to lead a truly independent life. You also have writers like William White with his Organization Men, criticizing the monotony of modern work and the emptiness of suburban life, and the pervasive influence of advertising, creating the vocabulary for an assault on the nation's social values. Now, these people did have a somewhat limited impact on the American consciousness. They didn't really offer any kind of political alternative or have any real impact on the parties or government. They were, however, representative of a different idea. One of the places, though, where we're going to see actual rebellion, I guess you could say, is among young people. Teenagers kind of come into their own as a class of people, an age group that's distinctive. Teenagers are really almost, you could say, an invention of the 1950s. Previously to that, what we would call teenagers today were so lumped in with children in previous decades, but teens are now a growing part of the population thanks to the baby boom, and that brings on the rise of popular culture geared towards those youths. This popular culture suggests a significant generational tension lying just below the surface between these teens and their parents. There's a certain alienation from middle-class norms in films like Blackboard Jungle or Rebel Without a Cause, here you can see the poster for, highlights the kind of alienation that some young people feel from the world of adult respectability. Also spurs on a certain panic about juvenile delinquency. Sexual provocativeness encompassed by the new music genre, rock and roll, featuring hard-driving rhythms and sexually provocative movements, often associated with black musicians and dancers, to enthusiastic white and often young audiences. Popularizers of this early on were people like Elvis Presley, who made quite a stir with his gyrating hips, among other things. The mainstream reaction was, of course, the kind of juvenile delinquency panic, something that tends to happen a lot with young people and things that are popular among young people, and a growth in sort of codes of conduct for young people as well. We're also going to get slightly older. These are going to be people more in their 20s or so, small groups of poets, writers, and others who will rail against mainstream culture and garner the nickname the Beats. somewhat cliche photo up in the top right. The themes of their productions will include things like rejection of materialism, rejection of conformity, rejection of Cold War ideology and militarization, and instead an embrace of spontaneity, hedonism or immediate pleasure, often enhanced by drugs, and sexual experimentation. The Beats were, in fact, the precursors to the hippies that we often see as synonymous with the 60s, the next decade after. These groups are all going to play a role in challenging the general conformity of the age and add a little bit of excitement, I guess you could say, to an otherwise somewhat dull and cookie cutter era. Of course, the biggest upheaval of the era is yet to come, and our last couple of videos will focus on that.